There's no podcast this week, so please enjoy this classic edition from the archives. Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 28th of May 2012, the podcast that pimps the hose of science and reason. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's prank call the news of the bogus. Last October, this podcast reported that the feds raided Gibson Guitar and seized bundles of Indian wood because they bought the wood unfinished to be finished by American workers, which they claimed was a violation of the Lacey Act. Now, federal agents want to seize the guitars of rock and country stars because the wood used to make the guitars may run afoul of the same bogus law. Gibson guitars have been used by many famous rock and country singers, from Van Halen to Paul McCartney, and although the Lacey Act has been around for 112 years, it was only amended in 2008 by the Food, Conservation, and Energy Act to cover wood and plants. The Constitution prohibits ex post facto laws, so any guitars made with wood shipped before 2008 should be exempt. But apparently, the feds just don't care. The Lacey Act was originally the extremely unconstitutional prohibition of hunting game in one state and transporting it to another. The amendment was supposed to be enacted to preserve American jobs, but what it's really done is cost jobs, since it means that companies like Gibson can only import finished wood products from India, instead of just importing the wood and finishing it in the United States. It's just one more example of the government doing the exact opposite of what it's claimed to do. And now, Senators Lamar Alexander and Ron Wyden are working to stop the Department of Justice from seizing the guitars of performers, but only with guitars made before 2008. Hey, Senators, how about working to repeal this freedom-hating, job-destroying act entirely? It's not like you guys have done anything to actually create some jobs, so why not take this as an opportunity to stop actively destroying jobs that could be created immediately if you'd only just get your meddlesome regulations out of the way? It was just a fun and harmless prank. 6 students at Clayton, Indiana's Cascade High School, with the permission of a school board member, got a custodian to let them in after hours, where they covered the windows and the glass front doors with colorful post-it notes. The school administrators were not amused. They immediately fired the custodian and suspended the 6 students. 57 students protested this act in a peaceful sit-in, and then those 57 were suspended as well. Justine Weatherman, one of the suspended students, said,
So I was just shocked that, first of all, that they didn't think it was funny and that we actually got suspended for it and that someone got fired over it. I would never in a million years have thought that it would come to that. Maybe
Weatherman has learned a valuable lesson here. Bureaucrats do not possess a sense of humor, and their first instinct when presented with a surprise is to punish people. It's probably good that these students learned it now instead of, say, at an airport. According to another of the students, Anthony Kennedy,
we had talked to the head of custodial staff. He knew that we were going to be there. We talked to school board member. We had a key. We had all the permission we needed.
But that didn't stop the superintendent, Patrick Spray, from insisting that they weren't suspended because of the posted prank, but because they were trespassing. Hey, Spray, if they have permission to be there, they weren't trespassing. You hardly need a law degree to know this. Once more, we stagger in amazement at the ignorance of those who are supposed to be teaching our children. The fired custodian was Kim Rouse.
They had talked to numerous people and so forth, and I didn't think that I would get in trouble or fired over it.
There is still no word on whether Rouse will be reinstated. I know I say this a lot, but what the hell is wrong with our educational system? And I think the answer clearly is, it's run by bureaucrats who seem to care more about power and keeping order than they do in making a positive environment for kids to be educated in. The House Subcommittee on the Constitution, try to say that without cracking up, had a hearing to discuss a bill that would ban all abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy in the District of Columbia. And just like the last such hearing, women are being shut out of it. And in this case, it's the woman who represents the district herself, Eleanor Holmes. Wow, how transparent can you get? With this one act, they show that not only do they not care about women, they don't even care about representing the people this law is going to affect. This bill and everything around it is nothing more than election year pandering to backwards conservatives who still haven't left the Bronze Age. D.C., not being a state, falls directly under the jurisdiction of Congress under Clause 17 of Article 1, Section 8 and Clause 2 of Article 4, Section 3, so the ordinary restrictions on federal power do not apply. But, of course, our founders never intended for the seat of political power to also become a population center. Nonetheless, D.C. has for decades stood as a shining example of the failure of the federal government, in pretty much every area: crime, education, economy. If the federal government can't even manage that properly, how are they supposed to do it for the rest of the country, too? Not only did they not allow women on the panel, they deliberately stacked the witness panel with anti-abortion doctors. Only one witness was allowed to speak against the bill. Really, what did they think would happen if the bill passed? D.C. isn't very big. A woman could just as easily drive to Virginia or Maryland and have the procedure done. I think the only real effect this could have is to prove, as if anyone needed to anymore, that Republicans are not interested in freedom and small government, but in interfering in the most intimate parts of our lives and using outdated Bronze Age mythology to do it. It seems that the only thing Congress hates more than restrictions on meddling in our private lives is when private companies come out and prove they can do a better job. That must be why Congress is attempting to end NASA's competition among multiple private companies to deliver a completely private solution to ferry astronauts to the space station. This competition comes after NASA decommissioned all of its shuttles, without being able to have replacements ready. The shuttles, which did represent a success in many ways, were failures in others. The idea of having a reusable craft was to cut down on costs. But the U.S. military intervened and required that the shuttles be big enough to deploy spy satellites. NASA attempted to compromise by having different-sized craft, a smaller one just to take astronauts into space, a big one for the military, and others in between. But no dice. All of the shuttles had to be these huge monsters, which were far bigger and heavier than necessary for most of what they were doing. The result was that many, if not most, shuttle missions ended up being more expensive than if they just used disposable craft to begin with. And some say that the two disasters of Challenger and Columbia would likely never have happened with smaller craft, no larger than necessary to complete the mission. So now, NASA is looking to private solutions. They're using a competitive model which can bring in results years ahead and billions of dollars cheaper than what the normal government procedure would. Basically, handing a single multi-billion-dollar contract over to a single big contractor. In this model, the contract would go to the safest and less costly option that can be ready sooner than the other offerings. But the House doesn't like that. The Republican-dominated House, you know, those good small government Republicans who like things like free markets and competition, yeah, right, have passed a budget calling for NASA to choose one contractor now and put all of the money for development into that one company. Supposedly, this would speed up development, even though in the past it's always resulted in slower development and greater expenses. How bogus can you get? Just look at SpaceX, the company that is said to be the first private company to offer trips into space for the average Joe. Or at least the average Joe with hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on a trip. Their Dragon spacecraft is already the first commercial spacecraft to successfully dock with the International Space Station, and is scheduled to begin delivering cargo to the station this August. It's already working! NASA's model will increase innovation, and not only will it save taxpayer money and deliver a solution faster, it will also have greater implications for the rest of us. The innovations developed by the competing companies, even the ones who don't get the bid, will be used elsewhere and benefit our lives in ways that can't even be predicted. NASA realizes that private commercialization is the way of the future. Whereas the Republican Congress just seems so steeped in business as usual, there doesn't seem to be any real hope there. And the Democrats aren't any better in this regard. When will we learn? And now for a bit of good news. U.S. District Judge Catherine Forrest has struck down the indefinite detention portion of the NDAA, saying it was worded so broadly it could even be used to indefinitely detain American journalists for exercising their First Amendment rights. She also said the law was unfair because it subjects people to the threat of detention even when they had no intent or knowledge that they were putting themselves at such a risk. Quote, An individual could run the risk of substantially supporting or directly supporting an associating force without even being aware that he or she was doing so. The lead plaintiff in the case was Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Christopher Hedges, who has interviewed Al-Qaeda and Taliban members. He was afraid that just writing stories about terrorists and including their point of view might subject him to arrest and detainment without trial. Quote, "Ever since the law has come out, and because the law is so amorphous, the problem is you're not sure what you can say, what you can do, and what context you can have." So he filed suit to deny this power to the military. The judge ruled that not only did he have standing to pursue the case, but also issued an injunction to halt this activity that amounts to legalized kidnapping. In fact, the judge repeatedly gave the DOJ the chance to preclude standing for the plaintiffs if they could state clearly that none of the conduct they engaged in would subject them to indefinite detention. But the DOJ refused to do so. Yes, the people in Congress lied to us. The indefinite detention sections really do apply to Americans. How could they not? If you don't even have your basic habeas corpus rights, how would you even prove you were an American? They could just claim you were foreign, detain you, and there would be no way of proving your citizenship and getting released. Which is why it's a little disappointing that Forrest only made this injunction apply to citizens. First off, our First Amendment rights, and for that matter our Fifth Amendment rights, which are just as threatened by the NDAA, do not depend on someone being a citizen. Everyone has these rights. The Constitution is very explicit about what rights apply only to citizens, like the right to vote, and these are not among them. The court also rejected the argument in President Obama's signing statement, asserting that this gave the government no new powers of detention. Congratulations to the plaintiff on winning what has proven to be an uphill battle in our courts, actually getting them to agree to stand up for our civil liberties without caving to whatever the president's administration wants to do. Hopefully this is the start of a good and long trend to undo these tyrannies imposed upon us and supported by nothing more than fear-mongering. And now it's time to miscount the miscreant that is this week's biggest Bogon emitter. The state of Maryland has denied a spot on the ballot for the Libertarian and Green parties by throwing out a whopping 60% of the petition signatures gathered. And now, the Maryland Court of Appeals has upheld this denial unanimously, 7-0. According to Maryland law, a political party must get 10,000 valid signatures for ballot access. Despite the fact that there are over 10,000 registered libertarians in Maryland and that their gubernatorial candidate got over 14,000 votes, they still have to go and petition to prove to the state that they can find at least 10,000 voters who want the libertarian option. This entire mess is bogus from the get-go. But despite the fact that both the Libertarians and the Greens had turned in well in excess of the 10,000 signatures, the Maryland Board of Elections threw out 60% of the signatures for both parties. The court sided with the Maryland BOE, saying that the signatures they threw out weren't valid, despite the standard that the printed name, address, and birth date of the voter is sufficient. As stated in the decision itself, quote, "A signature should be validated if there is sufficient cumulative information to identify the signer." But the parties showed that the BOE rejected signatures for things as simple as the signer omitting a middle initial. After agreeing that the facts were not in dispute, the court sided with the BOE anyway, saying that the standard was, quote, "only in the context of discussing legibility of petition signatures." What? Legibility? What happened to that bit about sufficient to identify the signer? By the way, while the BOE was ruling the signatures invalid, they were still using them to update their voter files. Wait, so they're invalid and don't count for the petition, but they're still considered valid and accurate enough to update voter registration information? Sounds like they were sufficient to identify the signer to me. But the court went even further. Quote, "Once appellant evaluates a petition entry by an individual and determines whether to validate or invalidate the entry, any other entries by the same individual on the same petition that are subsequently evaluated by appellant are duplicates and should not be validated and counted." Wait, so you kick out a signature for bogus reasons. That same valid, registered voter tries to sign again and it's automatically invalid just because they kicked it out before? How bogus can you get? The only option left to these parties is to pile thousands of signatures on top of the BOE, forcing them to take even more time and taxpayer money to go through them, throwing out as many as they possibly can. Of course, this is nothing new. States all over the country use every excuse in the book to keep third parties off the ballot. If third parties are so fringe and don't have a chance of being elected, why make them go through all of this? Why not just let them on the ballot and let the voters decide? Because, of course, one of the important ways they have of making sure third parties have little chance of electoral success is to make them waste time and empty their coffers collecting signatures just to get on the ballot, while giving the Democrats and Republicans a free pass. They have more registered libertarians than the signature requirement. More people voted libertarian than the signature requirement. In any decently run democracy, this would be more than enough to ensure ballot access, and any court interested in justice would have smacked them down for the election rigging they so clearly engage in. But no, the Board of Election is nothing but bureaucrats, and judges nothing more than politicians in robes. They are as beholden to the two major parties as the legislators and governors are. But when it's this transparent, one wonders why the people of Maryland don't descend on their capital with torches and pitchforks. Here's hoping the two parties manage to overcome these hurdles and give Maryland voters a real and meaningful choice in November. Until then, I guess we'll just have to settle for making the state of Maryland this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to debug the source code of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. The great thing about school is it's a place of learning, where discussion of current events teaches students to think and be informed. Except apparently when you criticize the president. At least that was the case in Tanya Dixon-Neely's class, where she yelled at a student for just that reason. Another student recorded and uploaded the altercation.
No, this was on the news the other day, how people were bullying. He and another guy held the guy down when they were in high school and shaved the guy's head.
Yeah, but they only called it a prank.
Wow. But didn't Obama bully somebody though?
Not to my knowledge, I didn't see him.
He went into a high school and admitted to bullying this girl in high school.
I don't know, but didn't I tell you that we would not be doing the grading, talking about the grading?
Well,
but didn't I tell you
if you're gonna trash Romney,
no, because there's no comparison. He's running for president. Obama is the president. Listen, he is due respect that every other president is due.
it's still the same concept.
Sorry, no it isn't.
Yeah, it is.
No, it is not.
If you're gonna talk trash about one side, you gotta talk trash about the other.
No, darling. Let me tell you something. You got to realize this man is wanting to be what Obama already is. Okay? There's no comparison. That's the second time you try to have a little debate with me about Obama.
It's just
and it's gonna stop.
It's just a question.
No, because that's disrespect. That's disrespect.
You're disrespecting Romney. You don't even know that.
This man is a presidential candidate.
But
He's not the president.
But he's just a man. Obama is no god. He's still a man.
Listen, let me tell you something. You will not disrespect the President of the United States in this classroom.
I'll say what I want.
Not about him, you won't.
As if that weren't bad enough, she steps it up.
Do you realize that people were arrested for saying things bad about Bush?
It doesn't matter, does it?
No, do you realize you're not supposed to slander
I'm
the
not
president.
slandering. I asked the question.
But I'm saying to you, you're not supposed to slander. People were arrested for saying derogatory things about Bush.
Oh, wow. Wonderful, Neely. Aren't you supposed to be teaching them things about the First Amendment? How we in this country have the right to say whatever we want, even if it criticizes those in power?
You would have to say some pretty effed up crap to get him to be arrested. Because they cannot take away your right to have your opinion or your freedom of speech. They can't take that away even if you speak unless you threaten the president.
Exactly. And as bad as Bush was, he never actually arrested anyone for criticizing him. Sounds like the students know more than the teacher does. The student's friend, the one who recorded the conversation, did so at the request of the student so he could prove to his parents what the teacher has been doing, including pushing her agenda and shouting down students. So this hardly sounds like it's an isolated incident. After the video was uploaded, the student's parents took him out of school and enrolled him elsewhere. As for Neely, she's been suspended. With pay, of course, pending an investigation. Okay, so people are complaining that Neely is pushing a liberal agenda. But even if she weren't, even if she were stating this on general principles and not her love of Obama, it would still be highly inappropriate jingoism even for a government school. And given that it's largely the teacher herself who is the source of the disruption, one wonders how much her students are actually learning in their class. If they're learning anything, it's from each other. Not to mention the anti-authoritarian lessons that are always learned from such an out-of-control authority figure. You know, now that I say it this way, maybe the students are on the right track after all. And maybe this is a good trend. Students recording bad teachers to expose them to the world, just like with the police. And maybe soon people will stop just taking their word as gospel truth. If nothing else, it may serve as effective class discussion that Tanya Dixon-Neely has talked herself into becoming this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this videotaping, Bogon escaping, octane rating, mistranslating, father raping, low bond rating, carbon dating, figure skating, and barrel scraping edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Abbie Smith. Politicians and people of God are useless, stupid creatures that need to get real jobs and contribute to society like everyone else. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.